Hello, Rebel, and welcome back to my life. I did get a haircut. Thanks for noticing. I want to make two shout-outs today. First, if you think that today's video looks a little bit different, it does, and that's because my friend Angus McMillan lent me his camera to film this month's YouTube videos on, and I mean, I don't know how you feel about it, but it looks amazing to me. It also lets me do a bunch of stuff that I can't normally do. Like right now, I'm way up close on the camera, but as I slide back, the camera just shifts focus to follow me, which is so cool. And the second shout out is to Jason from my Discord server, who suggested today's topic, and I'm really stoked about it. By the way, in case you didn't know about my Discord server, it's a really awesome place to hang out with writers and nerds and a bunch of other cool people. Link in the description. All right, today I want to talk about storytelling as a dungeon master or game master for whatever tabletop role-playing game you're playing and how it differs from storytelling as an author. In case you're new here, I'm a fantasy author. That's what I do. It's my job. I write fantasy novels. But storytelling in tabletop role-playing games it's extremely different from storytelling in a book or any other form of traditional storytelling or media. If you're a dungeon master and you try to approach storytelling in tabletop role-playing games the same way that you would for a book or other form of traditional storytelling, you're gonna run into problems, and I really feel like it's gonna make the experience disappointing to you and, more importantly, to your players. So the first thing to remember on this topic is something that is said so often about Dungeons & Dragons that it's like pretty much a cliche. And it's that Dungeons & Dragons is a form of collaborative storytelling. You're not telling the story alone, you're telling it with your friends. Now, I know you've already heard that before, and I know you understand that. But do you? Because I feel like a lot of people have heard this and feel like they understand it on a surface level, but don't actually apply it to the games that they play. And dungeon masters can be particularly prone to this, but players can do it too. But okay, starting with dungeon masters, sometimes other DMs will talk to me about their campaign and their setting and their story, and it starts to set off some alarm bells in my mind. And most of those alarm bells go off because the DM refers to the campaign and talks about the story they're going to tell to their players. Now that might sound innocuous enough to you, but I really don't think it's a good framework to approach your campaign. Because if you're telling a story to your players, then you, my friend, are not collaborating. And this can be very difficult to confront, because as a DM, you are putting in more work than anyone. You are doing so much stuff behind the scenes to make what happens at the table happen. And so it's frankly understandable if you feel a little entitled to have events or the storyline progress in the way that you want them to, the way that you decided it should be beforehand. But like, that's railroading. And pretty much the whole community has all collectively agreed that that's a bad thing. Like, you have to ask yourself why the other people are at the table if you're just telling them how events unfold and occasionally letting them roll dice to slightly influence things. And if the answer is so that you have a captive audience to listen to the story that you're telling, well then just install a good basement dungeon like any author does. I think a big contributor to this confusion overall is that so many of the tools a dungeon master uses are the same tools that any writer has in their toolbox. But some of those writing tools, and some of the most basic and most important writing tools when you're writing a book, are ones that you should stringently avoid when you're playing Dungeons & Dragons. Don't get me wrong, some of the tools are amazing. Like the entire sub-tool kit for world building, that is immensely important to Dungeons & Dragons. Like, it is possible to world build too much when you're writing a book, but you pretty much can't world build too much when you're talking about Dungeons & Dragons. It's impossible. Characterization is another thing that applies to all writing and to Dungeons & Dragons. Memorable NPCs, whether they be villains or allies or just random side people, are probably going to be the most memorable things about your entire campaign. So it's well worth your time to learn everything you can about character motivation and differentiation and character development. Description is another really useful writing tool that applies well to Dungeons & Dragons. You don't want too much, because if it's too much description, then again, you're just sitting at the table talking while all your players sit there and listen. But the right amount of well-crafted description can just immediately throw your players right into whatever scenario you're putting them up against. Conflict. Conflict is everything in storytelling, and definitely in Dungeons & Dragons. It's the most important aspect of any story, so finding new and creative ways to create conflict is like essential for a DM. But here's the thing, and it's gonna hurt some of you to hear this. You have to give up on plot. And I mean capital P plot, where everything interrelates and everything ties together and wraps up with a nice little bow and everything is totally satisfying and progresses with the right pace. Like, of course, you can have vague ideas of where you want your story to end up and who you want your big bad evil guy to be at the end of the whole thing. But, and this is really hard, you have to be willing to just throw all of that out the window at a moment's notice when the situation requires it. One of the most important aspects of plot that you just have to get rid of and stop thinking with is 3-act structure. D&D campaigns don't have acts, they have arcs. And arcs have beginnings, middles, and ends, but it's incredibly rare for them to just wrap up very neatly the way they do in books and movies. Because D&D is a lot more similar to real life than it is similar to books and movies. And real life doesn't follow act structure. It just doesn't. The only context real life has, the only way that it appears to have a 3-act structure is in hindsight. Moment to moment, when you're living it, it's not there. In the moment, there is just what's going on right now and who you are as a person that is pulling you from one situation to the next, one moment in time to the next. Now, of course, this is not to say that you should not have any through lines or themes in your storytelling at all, because that's another bad habit DMs can fall into. They can get to the point where they're just kind of winging it and making up everything as they go along. And this can result in a campaign which maybe has a few good and memorable moments, but it doesn't really feel like it means anything. The players don't feel like the adventure matters as much because nothing seems to have any relation to anything else. So how do you avoid this side of things? How do you walk this middle ground? How do you keep yourself from railroading your players while also not throwing them into a sandbox that's so open that they feel like there's no point? Well, I believe it is through the use of one storytelling tool that I haven't talked about yet, but which I believe to be the single most important storytelling tool in any Dungeon Master's toolbox. And that tool is the plot hook. Plot hooks are incredibly important and one of the best ways to make your campaign feel meaningful to your players, and yet I feel like it's a subject that's often discussed in a wrong way, or that at least maybe like a lot of people don't understand. I feel like part of this might be because plot hooks aren't that widely discussed when it comes to subjects like books and movies. In terms of storytelling, a plot hook is like the reverse of plot itself, where plot hooks are much more useful in role-playing games than they are in like books and films. I mean, I feel like there's just less info about plot hooks in general. If you Google what is 3-act structure, you get more than 1.6 billion results. If you Google what is world building, you get over 5 billion results. If you Google what are plot hooks, you only get 76 million. And sure, that's 76 million results, but with so much fewer to choose from, the results just aren't as good. In fact, when I looked, the whole first page of the Google search was a bunch of people asking what are plot hooks, and then a bunch of people arguing in the comments about what they actually were, as well as some articles giving examples of plot hooks, but not actually a clear definition. And then a bunch of arguments in the comments about what plot hooks were. So what is this exact definition? Well, I'm not going to try to be like the central authority to define it for all time, but I am going to try to explain the way I think about plot hooks, why I think they're such a useful tool for a dungeon master, and the way that I try to use them in a game. See, I feel like a lot of people think of a plot hook as something that ensnares your readers and draws them into the story. The hook digs into the mind of your players, and it is pulling them through the narrative. That's not how I think of plot hooks. I think of them as like hooks or tacks on a board, like the board of some conspiracy theorist who's trying to piece everything all together. I'm going to show you a simple visual representation of what I mean, and I want to clarify before I do that I don't actually do this when I'm DMing. I don't actually construct a physical cork board of all my plot hooks, although like, it's also kind of cool, and I might try doing it in the future, but this is just for demonstration purposes. Some kind of visual representation might be helpful to you when you're trying to implement this advice, but just like know that I don't do this. It can be a lot easier to visualize things when you have a physical representation that you can like put your hands on and move it around a little bit rather than just trying to keep it all in your head. So let's say you're doing your world building and figuring out the themes and the storylines that you want to explore, and they manifest themselves in a few different ways. Because it's a very common thing that a lot of people in the D&D community know about, I'm going to borrow from Critical Role Campaign 2, so like spoilers for the show, but if you don't care about spoilers, or if you already like know the story really well, I just think it's going to help you understand the way that I think about these things a lot more clearly. So let's say that we want to explore big political themes, and so we start with two big kingdoms, sort of, big governments, the Dwendalian Empire and Xhorhas. So each of them gets a card and a hook, in this case a thumbtack, on the board. That's our starting point. Now, you know that you want to start the campaign in the Dwendalian Empire, and then one of your players comes up and says that he wants to play a sad wizard boy, and so you tell him that he's from the Soltris Academy, and that becomes a new hook on your board that is tied to the Dwendalian Empire. Now, another player, their character just became a warlock, and now that they've got these new crazy magical powers that they don't really understand, they want to go somewhere where they can learn more about that. And boom, you just tell them, hey, they would have heard of the Soltris Academy, and that's a place where people learn about magic, so there's got to be information about magic there. And now they are tied to a plot hook as well. Now, this one plot hook is tied to both of your players and creates a link between them before they've even met. And that's wonderful. This is what you want. Now, another one of your players is part of a clandestine organization of monks that investigates evildoers and punishes them a little bit outside of the law. So, hey, you toss some evil people into the Soltris Academy, and then you add an organization that runs it that has even more of these evil people, and that's called the Cerberus Assembly. And then you link those evil people to your sad wizard boy and make them the reason that he's sad. So this is a good starting point for like creating an environment for your characters to all feel somewhat tied together by things, but you want to explore themes of big politics and conflict between nations and how sometimes in these conflicts, neither side is entirely right or entirely wrong. So you've got this other big empire over here that you started with, and you want to start linking some of your plot hooks to that. And so in the middle of these two great nations, you create this mystical, mysterious, magical artifact that is extremely important to one of the nations because of its religious significance, but really important to the other nation because of its power. And so these same evil people that you've already established plot hooks for, they're involved with the magical artifact. They've found one in secret and they've been doing experiments with it. And after your players have been playing for a little bit, suddenly you drop one of these artifacts right into their lap, and boom, now they're suddenly in this web that you've created. This artifact links to the kingdom that they started in, but it also links to the other kingdom that they've only heard vague rumors about, but it also links to the evil people that they know about. Some of them do anyway, and some of them are learning more and more about them as time goes on. Now, of course, if you're very familiar with Critical Role, you understand that this is a grossly oversimplified board. This doesn't even begin to cover all of the things that are going on in the Dwendalian Empire or Xhorhas or with the other characters in the party or anything else. But you can already begin to see how many intricate layers of story can be built with just a few of these connections. And the more connections you draw, the more it all starts to feel real and important to the players because it's already connected to things that they themselves have chosen to invest in. Because the best part of organizing things this way is that it becomes almost impossible to railroad your players. For example, you can have, and you know, in the case of the show, they did have this whole other section over here where there is one of the characters who died and was resurrected and doesn't remember anything from before he died. So there's some kind of magical ritual that brought him back from the dead but wiped his memory, and that's real friggin' weird, and nobody knows what that is or how that could have come about. And you know, and I know, as viewers of the show, that there's so much other stuff tied to that plot hook, right? But the players never chose to explore that plot hook. There were a few other things tied to it, sure, maybe, but they never wanted to go in that direction. And so none of those ideas ever needed further development or refinement. That is the other thing about this type of plot hook organization. You can start with the broadest strokes, big, wide themes, stories, elements, whatever. And then based on where your characters decide they want to go, then you develop further in that direction. You establish more sub-hooks and subplots and ways that they can go, which you can then develop further based on the next branching path that they choose. And you can link those connections more and establish more reasons for them all to be related to each other. Until eventually, your players feel like you had all of this planned out and roadmapped from the very beginning, even though you've kind of been making it all up as you go along. That is all I've got for you today, Rebel. An extra special shout out to my supporters on Patreon who make this and every video on my channel possible. If you want to be one of those awesome and incredibly attractive individuals, click on the Patreon link in the description below. I would especially like to thank my new patrons who joined in the month of July: Brent Kane, Ian J. Middleton, Jack F. Erickson, Jorge Luia, Joshua Slider Kerwin, Chris, Maeve Shea, Mark Monroe, and Michael Bishop. Sorry if I butchered your name. Thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you next Friday. Bye!